So, a warm good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are actually. It's Tamara Russell here from the Mindfulness Center of Excellence, and very excited this evening to welcome you to another Let's Talk About webinar. So we've been hosting a series of webinars over the last few months, trying to tackle some interesting topics in the mindfulness space, talking to people who are doing work a little bit on the edges of the space, but perhaps which can shed light on some of the work that we're doing with mindfulness, no matter what we're doing. And just wanted to alert you, you can visit the Mindfulness Center of Excellence YouTube page to find videos on some of these topics that we've covered already. And then also we've got a few coming up as the year carries on. So today's topic here, what mindfulness in society really means. And I'll introduce you to Steven shortly, who will be talking us through this topic. So there is a YouTube channel that you can go and visit where you can see the talks. Most of them are uploaded, but doing my best to keep up with the technology and stay mindful at the same time. And you can also join the mailing list of the Mindfulness Center of Excellence. We have a Facebook page where I'm posting various things, developing community of practitioners and people interested in mindfulness, but really a breadth of the mindfulness work. And so coming out of the screen share to introduce Steven Stanley. So good evening, Steven. Finding you in Cardiff. Hello and welcome.
Well, thanks, Tamara. I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak with you. And hi, everyone all over the world.
So many of the people that are chatting to me on these webinars are people that I meet in my travels around various conferences and trainings and discussion groups. And Steven was always a great person to meet because he left me with this experience of a slight tickle in my awareness that there was something that I maybe needed to pay attention to that I didn't quite grasp yet, or I hadn't quite got some language or some frameworks around it to understand its importance. And we're going to be sort of diving into his work and how it can inform us as mindfulness teachers. But I'm going to show a slide now, which was an experiment that Steven was talking about when I first heard him speak. And I'd like him maybe to kind of introduce this experiment and maybe himself at the same time. Here you go.
Sure. Well, yeah, the experiment actually comes out of my background in social psychology. So really, I'm a psychologist, and especially in social psychology. And in social psychology and sociology, we have what's called breaching experiments. And a breaching experiment is where you do some kind of activity to momentarily disrupt or breach the normal, everyday way in which we live our lives, as a way of studying how that normality is itself being routinely produced, actually. And so in this experiment, which we call a breaching experiment or a standing still demonstration, we have a bunch of people ranging from 10 to, say, 200 people actually standing still in a public place, usually a busy place like a city centre. And they stand still for 10 minutes, standing, doing nothing, to see what happens, really. And these are very, very simple interventions, actually. From the point of view of an experiment, they're very simple to run, very quick and easy. They don't take very much resources, actually. But they can be fascinating. Very simple. So you're just stopping and you're just doing nothing, and you're standing still and you're watching what's going on and you're observing it, and you're actually remembering what's happening as you're doing it. And we've conducted these social experiments actually for about 5 years now in Cardiff, in different locations. And so the one that I showed that flashed up there on the screen a moment ago,
I'm coming back. Yeah.
showed that one, Tamara. This was taking place in Cardiff city centre, in the High Street. And these are our first year social psychology undergraduate students. On this year, there was maybe about 150 of them, on a Monday morning, in Cardiff, just standing still for 10 minutes. And then you watch what happens. And actually, this is a capture from one of my publications, which I'm happy to send people if they pop me an email, can send it to them. And it was actually taken by someone who was in a gym, overlooking the scene. Really? And then they Instagram posted it. So this person isn't a part of our research project. They Instagram posted it. Wow. And then, as you can see on the Instagram, there's a kind of little trail there of people trying to make sense of what's going on. Is it a flash mob? People are stood dead still. It's like an episode of Doctor Who.
Yeah.
And I think partly what's interesting in this is that we're taking mindfulness out into public space. We're not really framing mindfulness so much as a therapeutic tool, actually, but more as a form of social investigation. And in a quite interesting way. And also it dovetails with actually something that's becoming much more common now, which is the use of silence and sometimes stillness as well as part of public demonstration and public protest. And you actually see this very commonly now, in the silent walking demonstrations around public events, especially to demonstrate against sometimes the silence of politicians or public figures on particular social events, whether it's Grenfell Tower or the Black Lives Matter movement. And actually, we also restaged this experiment recently during the university strikes. So here in the UK, we had very large-scale strikes over university staff pensions. And we restaged the Standing Still demonstration on two occasions. One was in front of our students' union, who had been actually somewhat silent around the issue of the strike. And so we stood outside on the steps of the students' union, and people kind of were weaving in and out of us as they were going in and out of the union. And also we did a slow walking meditation actually around the perimeter of the main building of the university, where our Vice-Chancellor works, as a way of also demonstrating against his kind of tardy, belated response to commenting on the strikes and the student solidarity and support for the strikes. And actually both of those kind of mass standing still demonstrations were captured through social media and became then something that caught on up and down the country in different branches of the university unions. So I think it's just one illustration actually of the kind of some of the work I've been doing around taking mindfulness to the streets and topicalizing mindfulness in a social way actually, and not only in a therapeutic way, but also a way of investigating our social lives.
And we had one of the new groups that I've been working on is a group called the Heartfulness Group, and we had our session 7 was taking it to the streets. So it was compassion and mindful movement practices around the London Bridge area, through London Bridge train station, some poetry reading around getting stressed on the tube, and you know, what is it like to interact with people, and that embodiment bit. And I think that was the other thing that really connected our work, wasn't it? It was just that fact of like, you're in the body, in the investigation, in the world. Okay, multiple observational lenses coming, and I want to come back to that, but
yes,
let's stay with the embodiment bit, you know.
Yes, absolutely. And actually sometimes it's striking how simple but how profound, in this case standing still, but also of course we can speak about movement as well, can be. And actually being aware of your body, especially in spaces that are very busy, and connecting in that way, body and mind, or in an embodied way. And we can talk much more about that, but I think that's a really important emphasis in my own work and in yours too.
And I'm thinking about, I've run a couple of flash mobs myself, and I suppose there's two things there. One is how people interact with you. But I suppose the second also interesting thing here is the intention is quite different, isn't it? You know, the intention to sit in a meditative flash mob versus the intention to do what's basically a disruptive experiment in societal rules and norms and patterns. It's kind of like just dropping a little something in there, isn't it? In order to watch the ripples, in order to study how it impacts, you know, so the intention is different.
Yeah, I think actually the subtlety there, and there's maybe a continuum, because actually the way I frame a lot of those practices for at least my students and the people who were participating, who were actually activists or union members, was actually notice for yourself how it feels to do that. And that actually the disruption can sometimes be felt by yourself in your body, much more than it can be noticed by other people around. Actually, in many of the studies of these kinds of phenomena, like the flash mobs, they show actually that most people don't really take that much notice of what's going on, and they may not even realize that anything is happening, partly because it's so subtle. I mean, you're not dancing generally, you're not kind of singing a song, you're not, you know, staging like some kind of performance. Instead, you're just standing there. It's not so different to actually what people could be doing anyway, just waiting for people or something like that. So actually, a lot of people don't really notice what's going on or topicalize it at all. But for the person standing there, it can actually feel quite different, and it can actually feel like quite a big deal. To just stop, just to be still, just to be observing when you're supposed to be shopping or moving around or commuting. I mean, the exception to that actually was where just last year we did a breaching experiment of the same kind in the St. David's shopping centre here in Cardiff. And it was only a small group of us, maybe 15 to 20. And actually that felt much more disruptive and more what would be called a breaching experiment in the tradition of Garfinkel, who invented the breaching experiment idea. It felt very disruptive, and that was because the security guards were very, very unhappy with what we were doing, and they were very curious about what we were doing. And that did disrupt some of the social norms of being in that space. In a way that was different to how we had done it before. So I think it does also depend on the context you're in and how regulated that space is, how surveyed the space is, and how policed the space is. Shopping centres especially often have CCTV cameras, and they have a private security company there who are responsible for keeping people moving in the space. And for those people whose job it is to make sure that everyone can continue happily shopping, they're not so keen on people standing there still, potentially disrupting space.
And I mean, as you're talking though, I've got a question forming, which is, well, how is this different than somebody doing a performance piece, standing still for 20 hours in the middle of a shopping mall, or, you know, the creative intent versus the investigative intent versus the meditative intent, I suppose, but you could look at the same thing happening, people standing still.
Yeah, I think actually that it's not so easy to make those distinctions. Instead of intention, I would maybe think about it in terms of the response of the people. In the studies we've been doing, the standing still, so when people have been standing still in our flash mobs, they've tended just to be standing still. They're not freezing. So they're not freezing in the midst of an action, which may look as though it's more performative and like an artistic intervention. Instead, they are literally just standing, and they're not even adopting a meditation posture, actually. They're just standing still with their arms down. And I think something we've been working on very recently, actually, in a paper this year, which is that it partly disrupts the relation between a performer and an audience. People don't quite know what to do with that. If they don't have a performer there. It's like, well, am I an audience member? Maybe not. Sometimes it means actually sometimes people are joining in, and it may seem that they're actually joining in with the standing still because they're partly just waiting to figure out what's going on. They're waiting to see if we burst into song, or they're waiting to find out if we're demonstrating or making, or we're doing, the Remembrance Day. They've got the day wrong, and actually we're standing in respectful silence. Some people, they don't quite know what position to adopt, and whether they're an audience or not, and whether actually they're participants. And for some people we've spoken to, actually they found that we'd created a peaceful space in an urban environment that they actually quite enjoyed being in. And some people were upset when we finished because they were quite happy just chilling out and just watching what was going on in quite a bemused and humorous way as well. I think people enjoy it in terms of humor. Of course, it's easy to laugh at people standing still, but also it's easy to laugh at the kind of situation that we're in, just standing still doing nothing. That's quite funny. And so I think there's some of those nuances that actually are quite pleasurable. In the shopping centre one, it wasn't pleasurable at all. It was actually deadly serious because of the security guards. They made it very clear that this was not a joke. And so I think it's also about the space where you do it and how you stand still.
Yes.
I think that makes a difference as well as your intention.
Yeah, so there's that intent in the body, isn't there? The standing still in the kind of a more aggressive way versus passive, versus the kind of kung fu style, make yourself invisible,
Yes, there's amazing footage, actually. I don't know if you've seen it, of someone who is standing still in a qigong.
Yes, I've seen that. Yes, I know who that is. The Wu Wei. Yes, it's on my website, actually, under Cool Resources, Mindfulness Center of Excellence.
Great.
Cool Resources. I've got this standing stake practice in the middle of a busy Chinese Hong Kong summer.
That's right. And it's like a slow motion camera, and that's very powerful, actually, to watch that. And I think, it's quite nice to watch that whilst thinking about the other examples we've given as well. And also of demonstrations like the mass public silent demonstrations, where silence actually is becoming used in a very interesting political way. To make a point about collective silences and sometimes conspiracies of silence, and elephants in the room and so on. And that's very interesting. And it shows how actually that protest and demonstration doesn't always have to be made in a very loud and actually extroverted, sometimes violent way, although that also happens, of course, as well. But I think there's new forms of protest, new forms of demonstration, which are really interesting to think about.
Yes, and the silence, in the therapeutic context at least, is providing that space, for kind of minds to meet or to expand or to widen. And, this is the critical task of raising awareness, really, isn't it? And in all its various ways that we're interested in that. Yes. And I suppose when we do that, we're able to go a bit broader. We're able to kind of take a different view of what's going on. For me, I think your work is just even still, I thought I was doing that. But no, guess what? There's more. And this is, having that wider lens and then having the skills. And I think the playfulness is what came from that last bit of discussion, the playfulness to take a look at some quite serious things where other people don't really want to have the conversation because there's many factors that are stopping that conversation happening, and the really valuable role that I would also put artists in, and maybe your social sciences work to shine a certain lens on these areas and sort of see what's really happening. So
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I wouldn't want to make too much of a strong distinction between the social science and performance art, because actually a lot of the influence for the standing still experiments that I've done has been informed by performance arts, especially Marina Abramovich and her Sitting Silently, Artist is Present, which is a great film to watch as well if people are interested, where she sat in silence for, it was something like 3 months, like 9 to 5 in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, just silently sitting opposite people who came in. And that silence, as you say, can be very productive. I think in social sciences, there's a general tendency to see silence as always being oppressive, actually, and silence as always being about what I said, like conspiracies of silence and taboos, which can be repressive. But also, as we know from therapy and from these artistic and performance interventions, silence can actually be very productive. It can be productive of knowledge, actually, about the self, about the social world. And so I think that performance art has inspired me as well. And just loosening some of the boundaries around social science research, which sometimes can just be overly serious and scientific, and we need to do things in a certain way. Actually, we can learn from artistic practice, we can learn from performance. Yeah.
And I have one of my guest bloggers, a colleague, Roberto, from working with me from Portugal, from Brazil. He's written a guest blog on solitude, aloneness, and being alone, and some of the distinctions between this more productive quietness or silence, the opportunity for things to arise, the opportunity to observe what comes. Really important. And yes, this interdisciplinary working, I'm also really enjoying this with my pedagogy, with the mindfulness teacher training pedagogy. And I think, let's move to that, because trying to grasp the embodiment of mindfulness in the teacher as a concept, trying to think how to support mindfulness teachers to do that in their own way, and also being interested in different methods of teaching mindfulness. And I know that this is a big area of your interest as well. So yes, maybe just give a little introduction to that, and then we can dive into some juicy topics.
Yeah, sure. So I think for quite a while, I've as well as been doing these kinds of experiments in alternative ways of teaching mindfulness, which in a way are more socially engaged, like taking mindfulness out onto the streets, into public. I've also been for quite a long time now actually studying the practices of how mindfulness teachers teach. That project has been ongoing for some years, and it's mainly involved studying what we would consider to be so-called 8-week courses of mindfulness. So mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and studying some of the teachers who either founded those programs, people like John Kabat-Zinn, Mark Williams, and so on, and also so-called expert teachers who have been teaching sometimes and meditating upwards of 20, 30 years. And what we've been doing is very much coming at it from a social science perspective, from a qualitative perspective, actually, to try to understand how mindfulness teachers do what they do. That's a very basic intent of the research we've been doing. Because believe it or not, even though there's thousands of studies now in the field of mindfulness, as you know, Tamara, hundreds of scientific studies, and mostly focusing on the therapeutic efficacy of mindfulness, published in psychology and neuroscience, and generally showing that mindfulness are beneficial practices. But what's really surprising, actually, in all those hundreds of studies, is that there's very few that actually look at what mindfulness teachers do and how they do it in practice. There's even lots of studies actually even interviewing mindfulness teachers or questionnaire studies which asks them about what they do and how they think about it. But very few actually try to look at, as close as we can, at the processes and practices involved in teaching. So we've spent quite a lot of time actually focusing on a very small number of courses actually, and documentation of mindfulness teaching in action, partly because it's very difficult to get hold of that teaching due to ethical reasons, and also because the teaching tends not to be recorded that often. So we've been studying what we can get, where we can get in this research, and we've been looking at the interactions that take place between the mindfulness teachers and the students, sometimes using video recording, usually focused on the teacher, or sometimes including the whole class, and also recording the audio and then transcribing it, and then spending a very, very long time analysing how it seems they do what they do. And so I think what's interesting about that work is a number of things. One is that mindfulness teachers, especially when you think about embodiment, where a lot of the instructions around how to be a mindfulness teacher and how to teach mindfulness are all about how you should embody the practice yourself, and you should be mindful in your teaching of mindfulness. So it all comes from your personal practice, and it all comes from how you embody that practice in your everyday life and in your teaching. Now, that's all very well and good, and I would mostly agree with that. But the problem is actually that doesn't really tell us the whole story about mindfulness teaching. It tells us a very important part of it, which is what the teacher brings, and especially in terms of their intentions, what they bring. But it doesn't tell the whole story, because whatever intentions you may have, or whatever practices you may be doing, and however much you may be embodying mindfulness, the stuff that's going on in a mindfulness class, that however mindful you are as a teacher, you will not necessarily be aware of as you're teaching it. You actually, to become aware of other aspects of mindfulness teaching, you need the benefit of hindsight, actually, and you need the benefit of recordings of what actually happens, could be video or audio, and you need the benefit of a transcription.
Yes.
But also you need the benefit of the research that's been going on actually for 30 or 40 years now across a number of fields, mainly psychotherapy interaction and also pedagogic interaction between teachers and students. There's actually dozens and dozens of studies of this which can help us to understand what happens in a mindfulness class. And so that's the work that we've been doing. And out of it has come a number of different threads which partly relate to how mindfulness teachers tend to embody mindfulness in their teaching, and also how they lead what's called inquiry or dialogue processes within the course of mindfulness.
Yes, and I think there's a sense there, I think, in terms of how we connected, that sometimes when you're being a bit more exploratory and playful with the methods of delivery, you can get a lot of different insights about also, the more generic things around learning and how brains like to learn and which brains like to learn in which ways. And for me, one of the big insights, I think, was that really trying to take care of all the different learner types. This is kind of teacher training 101, isn't it? We've got different learning types, and minds like different kinds of learning, and how can we be thoughtful about that when we're delivering the content, and what's delivered and what's shared and how is it shared. And working with individuals with bipolar, I mean, they really loved all the kind of the stickers and the visual prompts. I've got stickers all over my phone and my laptop, just different ways of thinking about how to support a learning process.
Yes, I think that the courses we've been studying are much less about individual teachers and like one-on-one teaching of mindfulness, as might happen in the consultation or coaching, or indeed in dialectical behavior therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, which might be run in a more one-on-one way. I think our research has been much more on the group teaching of mindfulness, where mindfulness teachers are teaching somewhere between 10 upwards to 200 people. It's sometimes in very large scale events, or also where mindfulness teaching is being broadcast on a documentary. So we spent actually quite a long time studying the John Kabat-Zinn documentary Healing in the Mind that he was in back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And what we found actually is that even though some mindfulness teachers may well be tailoring what they're doing for particular people, there are also general patterns that we can find which might help mindfulness teachers who are learning how to teach mindfulness and how to embody it, or how to teach inquiry and how to teach dialogue. Now, I say this though with a caveat, because sometimes it is helpful to learn the way in which we do things. Other times it's not helpful to learn the way in which we do things. And I think I'll say just a couple of things on that before I say what the insights are and what the findings are. I think where it might not be helpful is where we become too rigid around certain formula, almost like a cookbook. Like, oh, to teach mindfulness, I need to go through this cookbook method. I think we need to be a little bit careful about that. It can sometimes be helpful for beginners to have a scaffolding around how they're learning, but eventually one probably does need to let go of the training wheels and then, go into the flow of what's happening and responding in the moment to what's coming up. So I'd say that as a caveat. The other thing is that actually working with very experienced mindfulness teachers and teacher trainers, looking at this material together, actually, because we did some of the research in collaboration with very experienced mindfulness teachers, is that they actually weren't so sure that some of the research should be used to train mindfulness teachers, precisely because it may distract attention from the teacher needing to be in themselves and needing to be in the moment. Because, as you know, when you're teaching mindfulness, it's very much about, I won't say shifting or attention shifting, because I don't like these kind of mechanical metaphors of attention, but it's certainly about moving one's attention from what's happening for oneself to what's happening for the other person. We can't be too much in ourselves, but equally we can't be too much in the other person. It was somewhere here in a way, but we're often moving. And so if we pay too much attention to the interactional dynamics, that takes us away from what's happening in us, which actually often people do find it very helpful when we say to them what's going on for us. As a teacher, it can give an idea of what's going on for us. And also it can pop the bubble of the pedestal of the mindfulness teacher, where it's assumed that we're some kind of being who's kind of hovering above reality in some way that's just not actually the case. So I say those things partly as a kind of a warning, or at least a reminder that we should always take these research findings with a pinch of salt, because ultimately we find ourselves in a situation and we work in the best way we can. But the way I captured it with colleagues is what I shared with you earlier. Was the first paper was around disciplined improvisation.
Yes, I love this phrase.
An interesting phrase, which I came up with my colleague Rebecca Crane, who was leading the project. She's the director of the Centre for Mindfulness up in Bangor, and we worked on this project together. Rebecca was very interested in how mindfulness teachers who are very expert, as in they've spent a long time actually learning how to not only be mindful, but how to teach mindfulness. How do they do what they're doing? And so what we did was we brought the tools of conversation analysis, which is a way of studying interaction between people, to studying mindfulness interactions. And she came up with this concept of disciplined improvisation from studies of teaching and pedagogic interaction between teachers and students. So in that field, when you're teaching in this so-called, they call it participatory or child-centered education, where it's like discovery learning, where children are supposed to learn through experience and discovery, and they're supposed to learn it for themselves. Now, the only problem with this is that often what they're supposed to be learning has been decided in advance by the teacher who has a curriculum that they need to teach. And so this is called, cued elicitation in this research area, where the way the teacher manages that dilemma is that they give subtle hints to the students about what they're supposed to be learning as they go on teaching. And so there's some lovely examples about primary school education, where the teacher is giving subtle or sometimes not so subtle hints about what the kids should be learning when they're teaching. And this actually happens in mindfulness. So mindfulness courses are much more highly regulated by the teacher than many mindfulness teachers would anticipate before they actually start looking at transcripts and looking at teaching in this way. A lot of mindfulness teachers might say, I would imagine, we've not actually done this work, but I would guess that they would think that students are learning through their experience. It's a basic idea that they're learning through discovery, and they're learning through the practice of mindfulness. And they're coming up with discoveries and insights based on their experience. Now, that's true, but what's also happening is the teacher is very highly regulating the space, the interaction that takes place, even the way the group is assembled through the seating arrangements, which often give the impression of democracy, all in a circle, which implies that we all have equal access and rights to speak. But actually, when you look at mindfulness teaching, it is very highly regulated. And so the concept of disciplined improvisation gives this idea that a mindfulness teacher, especially running an 8-week course in mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, often has a very particular syllabus to get through in those weeks. And yet, the students are supposed to learn that syllabus through their experience. So the teacher needs to be disciplined in the sense that they need to have that, curriculum, and they need to have that stuff kind of behind the scenes, whilst at the same time they need to improvise with what's coming up in the moment and responding to the novel insights and contributions that are being made by the students in the class.
The unique contributions.
Yeah, exactly. Which just to be really clear, they are very, whatever we say in any interaction is unique. I've never said what I'm saying now in precisely the detail and the nuance in which I'm saying it now. And that'll be the case with whatever next conversations we go into. So that novelty is completely real. And I'm not suggesting that that isn't the case. But it has to be balanced with the conventionality of a language, a shared language, which has come before us. And also in the context of mindfulness teaching, it comes in the context of a curriculum which has largely been created behind the backs of the students that are learning the course, and might be more or less present in the future. The other thing I would say just before kind of finishing on that is around authority. Because what I'm saying, and what I'm not saying here actually is that the authority of the mindfulness teacher is a bad thing. I'm really coming from the place actually where authority and power actually can be incredibly productive, actually, of knowledge. Just like we were speaking about earlier with silence, that space of the body, the space of silence, also the space of the authority relations between the teacher and the student can be an enormously productive thing. I see that all the time in lectures when I'm speaking, and students are writing, thinking, that inequality, that power relation produces knowledge. It's not only necessarily an oppressive thing, although of course, power can be abused and power can be used for oppressive purposes. But I think most of the time, the mindfulness class is a site of liberal power, being used in a productive way to produce knowledge and to produce also particular ideas about ourselves and who we are, and it can be involved in transformations at that level too.
Yeah, and I mean, lots of topics in there, but and I think a lot of what we end up talking about when you and I discuss these things are, how some of what can be discovered in the process of being mindful through a social sciences framework of mindfulness and its delivery and its pedagogy, really is also offering us up some very key insights about larger challenges in our wider society around power, hierarchies, complicity, silencing, the challenges of people in power having the capacity to really kind of regulate themselves, let's say, if it's the business sector, or kind of really have a high level of interest in the processes of their processes, but actually this is a view which gives us some methodology around how to do that. And the detail, really to be interested in the detail.
Yes. And I do think that it's helpful to go from both, as we were discussing before, looking at mindfulness, from out of mindfulness, into the social world, like, could be bringing mindfulness out into public and then engaging in public realm through mindfulness. But it's also, which is kind of like micro to macro in a way, the small to the large, but it's also equally about bringing those insights, which can sometimes be quite, macro, large scale insights from social sciences around systemic, inequalities, inequalities and power differences, actually bring that lens down into mindfulness itself, so that we can study what's going on, in a course of mindfulness through that lens. Because I think that's very important, because I think in the world of mindfulness, I think there's an idea that the awareness that's cultivated in mindfulness is a kind of indiscriminate awareness that actually, in principle, becomes aware of anything and everything and anything we might need. But actually, when you look at the mindfulness world from that social vantage point, which we've been doing, you realize actually that there's often things that are routinely not spoken about, actually, especially in public mindfulness conferences and professional conferences, where you do get routine avoidances around topics. And I think especially those are around inequalities and injustices and differences between people, whether that's based on social class or gender, race, sexuality, ability, bodily ability, ethnicity, nation state identification. A lot of the time I find when I visit, the mindfulness professional training events, and I spend a lot of my time at these conferences, I find that there are these absences of discussion around those issues. And now we may be lucky, they may come in through discussions of diversity and inclusion and accessibility and so on. But that's quite a narrow way of understanding those issues, actually. And if we instead started from a social perspective first, what would that look like? I think it would actually look quite different to how the mindfulness field looks at the moment, which is very much focused on psychology, on neuroscience, which, don't get me wrong, I'm completely in favor of this kind of research, but it will be unbalanced. It will be an unbalanced kind of approach if we don't also talk about these insights. coming from the social sciences. And I quite like and find useful the term that's used by David Smale, which is outsight, developing outsight. So David Smale was a clinical psychologist working in the NHS for 20 or 30 years in Nottingham. And he was a psychotherapist, but he was very critical of psychotherapy at the same time, in failing to develop this kind of outsight about the world in which we live. And I find that helpful as well as the insight. We also need the outsight. And to develop outsight, we need to listen to the historians, we need to listen to the political economists, we need to listen to the sociologists, the anthropologists, the geographers, and those debates and those discussions are going to become increasingly important, I think, as mindfulness becomes more embedded in mainstream society, as we're finding in the last 10 years or so.
Yes, and for me, this is the interdisciplinary working, like true interdisciplinary working, not multidisciplinary working, but really for the disciplines to get a good understanding of one another in order to collaboratively understand some critical truth, perhaps. But I think that the push, I think, to collaborate, it seems to be critical here around this. And so that's some of what my work is around, is how do we use what we understand from the mindfulness work, from other practices, including creativity, and getting more interested in the social sciences now as well, having met and had discussions with you, where are these platforms where we can get people to meet together in this non-threatening space with the childlike curiosity, without the defended ego of our professional titles and our professional training, and really get that dialogue going.
Yes. I think it's
not
very
easy,
no,
it's
it
really
absolutely
not easy.
It's really not. And I think in part it's actually the disciplining and the disciplinary nature of so much research and practice that sometimes can be an obstacle to that, where we in the social sciences we're encouraged to discipline ourselves and to discipline our students. And of course discipline is important, as we both know, but it's also important to be able to undiscipline ourselves, precisely to allow those kinds of dialogues to take place. I've worked for many years actually trying to create spaces for discussion of mindfulness, meditation, and broader contemplative practices, which encourages interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary and especially undisciplinary thinking. And that's been challenging, probably since 2012, so maybe 6 years now. I've been creating these spaces and events which have variously been, unconferences or retreat, kind of hybrid retreat conference spaces, where people come together from a less disciplinary space, in a less disciplinary way, in order to explore, especially work in the social sciences and humanities, and also in relation to professional practices and activist practices, to come together. Also we spent some very interesting time, meeting performance artists, up in Huddersfield at the Centre for Performance Studies. And that in itself is another really interesting space, which I think certainly took me out of my comfort zone, in terms of the kinds of, and I'm pretty used to, kind of unconventional margins spaces.
This is the martial arts thing, right? The embodied martial arts.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. Where we were dancing and, engaging in movement practices, and actually where those practices were being forefronted, actually, and where the research, in a sense, was taking a kind of back seat on that. I think that's really interesting. Yes. It's really interesting. And in the last couple of years also, I've co-organized these Mindfulness on the Margins events. And the margins here for me very much was about disciplinary margins and undisciplining, and creating spaces which are not so regimented from an academic point of view. Because then participants who come at it from outside of the academy and outside of research feel that we're overly academic, and we're not going far enough in the kind of undisciplined space. And that is challenging. There's no getting away from it. But I think I agree with you that I think if these practices of meditation and mindfulness and contemplation do not prepare us as a kind of training for actually being open to those difficulties and open to the challenges, then there's something wrong, actually. There's something very deeply wrong, actually, with the practices if they cannot support us in going to those challenging places. And often spaces where people are very angry, very upset, particularly spaces where there's a lot of trauma and oppression, actually, and injustice related to all of those identity and bodily positions I mentioned before, around social class, around racism, around gender, around inequality and sexism. And I think those spaces can be incredibly traumatizing, whilst at the same time also being potentially incredibly healing. I think it's often bound up, very closely. And it's those spaces, I think, that are going to become increasingly common now, I think, in the world of mindfulness, as people are trying to directly tackle issues of not just inequality and injustice, but also accessibility and inclusion and inclusivity, and especially work on decolonizing. I've spoken about undisciplining, but decolonizing as well. I think it's those edges are becoming quite urgent spaces, I think, in much of the mindfulness teaching communities now, which are attempting to not just theorize and critique and engage in that kind of academic intellectual exercise, but also then learn practically what do we do and how do we do things differently in order to create a more just world. And those are very, very difficult long-term questions.
Well, and I think one thing that's going to help us out there is this more recent project, and something that brilliant, definitely needs doing, and it's great that you're doing it, which is finding out some of those more undisciplined types like myself skating and exploring and creating in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways where mindfulness can go, how we can deliver it, what's needed, what works, what doesn't, what does it look like if you give it to somebody else to develop it and then kind of bring it back in. This sort of innovation of the Mindfulness Center of Excellence, this is really the innovation piece. And often I was sort of drawing together all sorts of people who came to me sometimes for supervision, sometimes just for chats at conferences, and sort of were saying things like, am I allowed to do that? Oh, is that mindfulness? Am I allowed to do that? And I think because I was always quite open with, well, I feel I'm allowed to do it, and I'm backing it with some good sort of strong theoretical positions to support my innovation, not just being totally, making it up, although there is a case for that as well. But, this question of, am I allowed, and is it okay? And I've gone a bit off-piste. And it was just clear that there was so much going on, that people were innovating, adapting, doing amazing work, but then feeling really shy and nervous to talk about it, which, again, for me, just felt like going in a little bit the wrong direction, especially given the posture that we try to take in a mindful stance. So I'll put up a slide, or tell me when you want the slides, and maybe talk a bit about this recent project. And
talk a little bit about the background first, and
then tell me when you want the slide.
The big debates which have been happening, which kind of might help to frame some of the issues that you've just been raising, Tamara. So over the last, I would say, 10 years, we've had a real boom, in mindfulness, and especially since 2007, 2008. Kind of around the financial crisis, you have a massive expansion actually in the provision and practice of mindfulness. It starts off earlier than that, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but we don't really get the kind of expansion we've seen until the early part of the 2000s. And I think what happens in the last 10 or 15 years especially is that you get a polarizing of debates over mindfulness. On the one hand, you have very vocal, often proponents of mindfulness, who are sometimes evangelical, actually, in their fervor for the potential of mindfulness as a kind of panacea, so a cure-all, for the ills of the world. Actually, for some, the kind of best hope for a world peace and the future of civilization. You hear mindfulness teachers speaking about this in this way. Just the other day, I was at the Mindfulness in Schools conference in London, and John Kabat-Zinn was there speaking, and he spoke very much in this way, that mindfulness might be our best hope, for the future of civilized life on the planet. And I think that gets polar opposite kind of debate from the critics of mindfulness. And I think that's probably best illustrated in all of the critiques of what's been named as muck mindfulness, which critics, suggest is a kind of very crass kind of corporate adaptation of mindfulness in corporate businesses, where mindfulness is being presented as a workplace well-being strategy to improve the productivity of workers, and this is getting a really hard kind of critique, actually, and a difficult one, by people like Ronald Purser in the United States, who wrote an article with David Loy, maybe back in 2013, on mindfulness as a self-help technique. And I think what's happened is that in a lot of the research and a lot of the public debate, those polar positions have been taken as the kind of only options, really. And even if you don't go down the kind of evangelical route, it's still the case that most of the 3,000 or so articles published on mindfulness since 2010 or so are really promoting the benefits of mindfulness. It's very, very rare that you get articles that show how mindfulness doesn't work, or how it's a terrible thing, or how it's actually more complex and nuanced. It's generally the case that
I think, to be fair, those debates are coming out, and I guess the work that comes to my mind around that is from Willoughby Britton's work. Sorry, I'm getting some late.
Go ahead. I think that's a really good.
So Willoughby Britton has written, sometimes called the dark side of mindfulness, or this unintended consequences, unexpected consequences of practices. Like many of the researchers, she started with kind of expert meditators as the first port of call to really understand from their perspective the phenomena. But, possible and likely that this is also happening in the more general public offerings, especially mindfulness that's being taught in the community rather than through NHS, where there is, the best practice guidelines. And that does include screening, usually, before the group is the best practice. Community groups, that may not be so possible due to resourcing or context.
Yeah, I think that's a really
good... It is, but the publishing of the null findings, again, a bigger problem in science. I'm curious how the mindfulness research community might respond mindfully to this. And I think, there's things coming in the mainstream science, publishing your trials and publishing your statistical tests in advance, registering your statistical tests for trials. I think that they're putting some processes in, but mindfulness, we want to go one deeper, don't we? We want to go more nuanced, more wider, more information, actually what's around this whole piece.
I think that's a really good intervention that you've made there, Tamara, because I think Willoughby's work addresses a very important absence, and actually it relates to what we were talking earlier around conspiracies of silence. And I think her work makes a very important intervention in saying, actually, with meditation and mindfulness and contemplative practices, things are very nuanced, actually, and we're not machines. even if we describe ourselves sometimes as machines, with some of the computing language, that's used around mindfulness, actually, when you practice mindfulness, you realize, well, generally speaking, you're a human being, and actually things can be more complex than we realize, and they can be more nuanced. And so I think her research illustrates really well there what you were saying, like around the dark side effects and so on, and also how we can actually learn to be a bit more mature about how we think about our experiences, and that they may not go into positive and negative. Like positive psychologists are routinely telling us that our emotions can be neatly separated into positive and negative ones. Well, actually, if you're a human being, you tend to find actually things are a bit more nuanced than that, and maybe that they're on a continuum. And I think that's really, really helpful. And I do think you're right. I think things are becoming a bit more nuanced. And I think one of the things that our project is doing is actually taking, especially all of those debates around the therapeutic efficacy, is it a good thing? Is it not a good thing? In a way, actually, what we're doing is either putting that to the side for a while, or we're framing those debates within a much wider context, which actually asks instead, what does mindfulness actually mean when we come to thinking about its place in the world today? What does it actually mean that we might be living in or aspiring to be in a so-called mindful nation?
Yes, and I read you this bit, which was from your university press release on this funding for this project, where they said, mindfulness is now being employed not only as a therapy, but also to ensure national well-being, happiness, flourishing, productivity, performance and efficacy, sustainability, creativity, and activism.
Yes.
What does the exponential rise of mindfulness tell us about the social world in which we're currently living? And, this is the Mapping Mindfulness Project, and really kind of widening the net, isn't it? Really widening the net about who's doing what and how are they calling it mindfulness, and in what way is it mindful?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this project, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust, is a 3-year project. We started it in October of 2017, so we're partway through our first year. And the aim really is to address what we see as a massive gap in the research literature on mindfulness, which is literally as basic as what is actually going on.
Great, what basic beginner's mind question. I love
it. So as we say here in The Fly, who are the people, where are the places, what are the practices that are being taught currently in mindfulness in the UK? So our focus really is the United Kingdom for the project. We're really studying the teaching of mindfulness. So who is teaching what and where and how in the world of mindfulness? So in a way, we're mapping the mindfulness movement in the UK, which is being seen as a real path breaker when it comes to other parts of the world. We're seen mainly because of the way in which mindfulness seems to be being mainstreamed, actually, across institutions, across education, like you mentioned before, education, workplaces, in politics, in business, and really, in quite an interesting way, the mindfulness world in the UK is a world which is seemingly becoming more, has been actually institutionalized, professionalized. The best examples of this are the university training centres for mindfulness. So Bangor, Exeter, Oxford, Sussex. Also in Aberdeen, they have a master's in mindfulness. And it's those that give the sense that something is happening in the UK, which firstly is quite different to what's happening in other parts of the world, where the world of mindfulness is not nearly as institutionalized or professionalized, but also where actually There's also interest in the government, you know, not just in the Westminster government, but in the Welsh and Scottish governments as well,
Yes.
around, and in Northern Ireland as well, around what does mindfulness mean when it comes to public policy, and the training of teachers, you know, in the criminal justice system. What does actually mindfulness mean? And so this project comes out of that gap, you know, that we really don't know what is going on, largely because most of the studies are not conducted in the social sciences and humanities. You know, most of the studies are conducted in psychology, where you wouldn't necessarily study these things, and you certainly wouldn't necessarily study them from a qualitative perspective and from a survey perspective, which is what we're doing. So we're really looking at the who, the what, the where, the why of mindfulness provision. And also the thing to understand here is that many mindfulness teachers have asked us, well, do I need to be trained in mindfulness to take part in the study, whether that's formal training pathway of any kind? And our answer really is that our study takes a very broad understanding of what is meant by mindfulness. You know, if you teach mindfulness in any capacity, in any form, in any context, then you really, and you're based in the UK, really you qualify for taking part in our study, because what we're interested in knowing is what is going on. You know, we're not interested actually in policing the mindfulness world, or setting up, you know, formal accreditation and so on. Our purpose really is to understand what is going on. Now, of course, that information will provide a very important resource and evidence base for people who are concerned about the training of mindfulness teachers, and who are concerned about accreditation, and they are concerned about where mindfulness is at with respect to those questions. It seems that the world of mindfulness is much, much broader and bigger than you would think if you were only to look at the 8-week courses of mindfulness and those people who are trained to teach those courses and have gone on those recognized pathways. Actually, many people are teaching mindfulness in many different contexts. In often, well, we won't really know our findings for a year or two at least, but what we're finding so far actually is that mindfulness is showing up in all kinds of places that are very interesting, and that don't necessarily follow the story about, you know, how training is supposed to happen and who's supposed to be doing it and so on. So I think it will also be an inspiration and an encouragement for teachers who are not necessarily teaching within a formal recognized pathway and model as well. So I think those are some of the reasons why I really encourage anyone who teaches mindfulness and is based in the UK or teaches in the UK to take part in our study. I'll just say the broad methods that we're using. So the first is a survey.
Yeah.
We're actually hoping to for every mindfulness teacher in the UK to take part in our online survey, which was launched last week. The word is going out about it in the next few weeks as we contact our stakeholder groups and to distribute it into the world of mindfulness, the networks, the organizations, the training organizations, and so on. That our survey has been launched. And that's the first phase, which is this large online survey. The second phase are interviews. So we'll be interviewing 150 mindfulness teachers up and down the UK. And we're very interested to contact people who are teaching mindfulness in different sectors. So the ones we're focusing on are health and well-being, education, businesses and workplaces, politics, and also religion. So we're looking at also the religious context, including Buddhism, but also other religions as well, like Christianity, Islam, and Sikh mindfulness practitioners as well. So actually our remit is very broad in terms of who we're including, and those 150 interviews will really capture people's journeys with and through mindfulness, which already are, you know, proving to be absolutely fascinating in terms of where people have come to this field from, and how and where they found themselves and what they're doing, and also what their views are on some of the big debates around mindfulness and so on. And then the third phase is case studies and ethnographic case studies of what's going on the ground in respect to those different domains. And actually mindfulness might look very different depending on the context in which we find it. And it might not be one single thing. It might not be a universal thing, but actually might depend on actually where it's being offered and for what purposes. So our website is www.mappingmindfulness.net, which we launched last week.
Yeah, great. So, well, I mean, I'll put the links out under the talk, and we'll kind of get promoting on that.
Thank you.
And as you say, you know, there's this recognition, and we have this all-party parliamentary group report that some people might be familiar with, their version of kind of mapping more the benefits of mindfulness across education, criminal justice, the workplace, and health.
Yes,
we had a brief discussion. I just want to highlight maybe just very relatively quickly that some of your broader thinking about the what, the why, the how, you know, keeping that lens getting bigger and bigger, you know, also some commentaries here in the Handbook of Ethical Foundations of Mindfulness, and you've kindly said that people can maybe email you.
Well, yes, do email me about that book. I can just say a couple of things about that book.
Yeah, the book, and then I'll flip back to the conference, but I'll leave this up so people can see it.
Yeah, so the Handbook of Ethical Foundations of Mindfulness really engages with the big debates that are happening around whether, you know, the ethics and morals of mindfulness are embedded and implicit in the practice, or in the embodiment of the teacher, indeed, or whether ethical frameworks need to be brought in from other areas such as Buddhism or from professional ethics, as well as the broader kind of cultural milieu in which we're living, which we've been discussing. So if people are interested in that handbook, which is released sometime later this year, do email me and I'll be in touch about that.
And then you were also going to say something about the Social Mindfulness Toolkit. So you can see, viewers, that we're going to have to get Steven back for another conversation because he's just got too much cool stuff going on. But 2 minutes on this, if you can.
So the Social Mindfulness Toolbox will be an openly accessible web resource featuring 16 interviews from people in 6 different countries who are developing socially engaged and alternative forms of mindfulness teaching in different contexts. And we're especially engaging with those people who are working on issues to do with social justice and environmental justice, and contemplative pedagogy. So we're actually launching that Social Mindfulness Toolbox at the Contemplative Pedagogy Network Symposium, which is happening in August of this year at Emerson College in Sussex. So do go to the Contemplative Pedagogy Network to find out more about that event.
Great. So listen, I think we're going to need to pause there, but I think, you know, as we know as mindfulness practitioners, when we widen the lens of attention, we get the opportunity to contextualize our thinking streams, our emotions, our reactions to the things that happen to us in life. And Steven's work really for me is doing this at the systems level, you know, serving as that kind of salience network that's kind of going, hello everybody, don't get lost in your slipstream, don't get lost in your own kind of hype, as they say, don't believe the hype, don't believe your own hype. And, you know, here's a kind of broader lens about, you know, what's going on at multiple levels in this work, whether it's how we do mindfulness, where we do mindfulness, who's delivering it, what the intention is. And, you know, just really amazing work. And it's been such a pleasure to chat to you. So do you want to say any final goodbyes?
Well, just thank you so much, Tamara. I really appreciate the time to spend talking about my work. It's been a great pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. And I just wondered whether it's helpful to finish on saying something that we spoke about before now, that actually some of these issues, they're challenging. these issues around the social and political and cultural aspects of mindfulness. And we may find things that we don't feel comfortable about. But I would hope that our practice would give us the stability, and the openness to be able to approach that difficulty and include it in our practice. And it can bring up challenging stuff, anger, sometimes feeling vulnerable, and sometimes, coming to terms with trauma and so on. These are challenging things. But I would hope that we could hold our practice, in that embodied way, so that we can include some of these critical threads, but always only at the time where it's right for us to do that.
Yes, and strong compassion, as they often talk about, which is that willingness to lean in, to go, oh my goodness, is that me? Is that us? Is that us that is doing these things? And Paul Gilbert, of course, a big influence in my work and for many people in this area, talking about the need to use our compassion and our mindfulness skills to do the shadow work from the Jungian perspective. We're not good or bad, we're both, and they're not really concepts, but that denial of the parts of self that are difficult or shameful is really where we need to get to, kind of maybe individually but societally as well. Those as you say, the collective silences, the conspiracies of silence. Much work to be done there, but listen, I'm so happy that we've had time to share this. I'm gonna sign off now, but thank you very much, everybody, for joining me, and I will do my best to get this recording out to you as promptly as I can, and saying goodbye for now.